If you don't know me, I am the director of Onward, a think tank set up in 2018 to renew the centre-right for the next generation by coming up with bold and practical new ideas and reaching out to new groups of people. And I am delighted to welcome you all here today for the 6th and penultimate instalment of our Level Up series. This was a series of events that we launched at the time of the budget earlier this year to bring together policymakers with industry leaders, with charities, with academics to put more meat on the bones of the government's ambitions to level up opportunity around the UK and to create a more dynamic and regionally balanced economy post-coronavirus. And in a moment, I'm going to hand over to our esteemed chair for this event. But before I do that, I just want to take a moment just to thank all of the people who've made this series possible. So in particular, the City of London Corporation, who supported this event, and I'm incredibly grateful for Catherine McGuinness for joining today's session, to Avanti West Coast Partnership, to Joseph Rowntree Foundation, City Fibre, Power to Change, NHSA and BAE Systems. They have all helped to make this series a possibility and I hope facilitated some brilliant conversations that will be informing policy. So far in the series, we've looked at a whole range of things from digital connectivity to how to build clusters of innovation, what role devolution can play in local economic growth, how to bring local jobs, good jobs to the places that need them, and indeed how public transport can play a role in levelling up. But today we're going to look at the question of investment. Who funds levelling up? And I'm delighted that for once I'm going to be stepping away from the chair's role today and handing over to someone who knows far more about the subject than me and who's led the debate in Parliament on some of these issues over recent months. And that person is Gareth Davies Mp. Gareth is the MP for Grantham and Stamford. He has, in particular, since he joined Parliament in 2019, developed a specialty around financing. He called for, in an Onward paper, a national development bank shortly before the Chancellor then went and did it. He's been at the forefront of calls for green gilts to finance the net zero revolution, and on a whole range of other matters is kind of leading the way on kind of new thinking in Parliament around investment and financing. And so there was no one better, I thought, to lead the discussion, and certainly someone far better placed than me. So I'm delighted to now hand over to Gareth. He will chair today's session, and I'm going to take a step back because he's far better qualified than I am. So Gareth, over to you.
Well, Will, thank you for such a generous introduction to everybody that's dialing in for this discussion today. Welcome. Levelling up, as we know, was a key manifesto commitment in 2019. It has been the focus of this government so far, beyond COVID, obviously. And this is about addressing the regional inequalities that exist in our country. And the government have already announced a series of measures already, whether it's the Levelling Up Fund, the National Infrastructure Bank, or the Skills Revolution and the Lifetime Skills Guarantee. Lots already taking place. But what we need to discuss now is who should pay for levelling up. And that's why it's so great that Onward are leading this discussion and setting up this event today. Joining me is a distinguished panel of experience and expertise specifically on that subject. Rupert Harrison is the former chair of the Council of Economic Advisors at the Treasury and is now at BlackRock. Felicity Buchan is the MP for Kensington, a member of the Treasury Select Committee and formerly of JP Morgan. Catherine McGuinness is the policy chair at the City of London Corporation. And of course, Jessie Norman, MP, is the Financial Secretary to the Treasury. So we are delighted to have you all today. How we're going to work this is every member of the panel is going to spend about 4 or 5 minutes outlining their views on this subject, and then we'll open it up to questions. If you do have a question, please put it in the Q&A section, which we're all getting very familiar with now. And we will identify the questions for the panel and I'll direct those questions accordingly. So let's start with the order that I listed. And Rupert, if you'd like to make your opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Gareth. It's always a great advantage to be the first speaker on one of these things because everything you say is new. I'll try and be very quick though, because the danger is always that you overrun and squeeze everyone else out. I think that the key point to start with is who funds levelling up, is that the answer is really in the title of this event, which is return on investment. And that in the end, you can't really separate financing and funding from all the other issues that you need to tackle in order to make a success of leveling up, and that if you create good places to live, work, and invest, that in the end the money will follow, and that's the sort of, I think, the kind of most important principle. If I split my comments into kind of private investment and then public investment, on private investment, and I think that actually this probably applies to both. There are some very important things we can do to increase the amount of finance and capital available for investing in projects that help leveling up. But I don't think that in either the private or public side, that it's really the availability or cost of capital that is the binding constraint. So I think it's important that there are some things we can do here, but in the end, as I'll come on to, I think the binding constraint is capacity, project selection, consistent long-term plans, pipeline of sort of investment options that capital can flow into. The reason that cost of capital isn't a problem fundamentally is that in the end there is a huge pool of capital that wants to invest in private sector projects that produce a stream of returns. So whether that's infrastructure, real estate, other kinds of real assets, this is kind of an incredibly hot area in finance. There's a huge pool of international money that wants to invest in these things, particularly when valuations of many other and particularly kind of listed securities have been pushed up to the point where people think that the opportunities for investment may be better in real assets. But there is a huge pool of capital that is newly available, and I'm sure that Catherine and Jesse and maybe Felicity as well will talk about things we can do to tap that, and that's particularly in DC pensions. So just very briefly point out, this is a huge UK success story. So that the combination of the Adair Turner's reforms, then implemented by Labour, then coalition, then Conservative governments, is that auto enrolment. We now have the latest figures I could find for 2019 was 77% of people saving into a workplace pension compared to 47% back in 2012. Yeah, it's a huge success story. We've just increased the rate. The savings rate needs to increase further, but there's a huge pool of capital in defined contribution pensions that should be investing in real assets, long life, long-term assets like this. And there are some technical issues that make that hard, that these pensions tend to be daily pricing, daily dealing, and there are regulatory reasons why it's hard for trustees to invest their members' money in these long-term assets. And I won't go into detail. There's a few, the long-term assets fund, so the LTAF proposal that the Chancellor's got behind it is crucial. There's a whole wider ecosystem needed to help DC pensions invest in these kinds of assets. There's a very specific issue with my BlackRock hat on about the fee cap. The trustees have a responsibility to keep fees for their members down, but a lot of these assets come with sometimes higher fees, but particularly performance fees. And I think that if some of the richest and wealthiest and most sophisticated investors in the world are very used to investing in vehicles that come with performance fees, and why shouldn't those be available also to massive savings of the UK pension market? And I think there is something we can do about excluding performance fees from the fee cap and finding a way to sort of limit overall cost in some other way. But that's, I'm sure others will talk more about that. Just very briefly, I think that I just wanted to say a few things about projects, both in sort of private and public investment, because I think that is really the constraint, is about having a pipeline of investable projects that are suited to local needs, credible, investable, and the capacity to do that. I think at a national level, we've come a long way to do that. So there's a national infrastructure plan, which I think has been improving in quality over time and is a genuinely useful tool. There will be the National Infrastructure Bank that Gareth proposed in his paper, and the government is getting behind. But I think there's a big lack of that sort of consistency and clarity of pipeline at a local level. It just doesn't really exist. And I think one of the biggest weaknesses in the UK is the sort of constant chopping and changing of policy around this. And I'm sure this doesn't apply to Jesse, but there is a real risk in the UK that when lots of things are controlled from Whitehall, you get a change of minister and you get an entirely new set of projects, and long-running projects get scrapped or new priorities introduced. And I think that one of the ways to get around this is to devolve a lot more of the project selection and design to the local level. I think that trying to design these sorts of local plans from Whitehall is never going to work. We don't have the capacity or the skill set. The UK is too big a country to do that. We're not Singapore. And one of the problems is we're not a big enough country, or we haven't historically been a big enough country to have a proper federal system or devolved system. So if you go to even the US, where we all think of the sort of land of the free market, actually there's an enormous amount of convening power and planning power that state governors and city mayors have in terms of directing these kinds of investments. And I think you also find that where local plans and development plans and industrial strategies are owned locally, they are less disrupted by a change of party control or a change of mayor or a change of governor, because there's local ownership by the local business community and the local political world that is sort of goes across party boundaries. So I think this would be one of my big calls, would be actually probably the most effective way to get consistent so project selection and design and relationships with investors is a proper further ambitious devolution of power. I know we're going to get a white paper on levelling up and English devolution in the autumn, and I think that's probably the most important single thing that we could do. That's the sort of, I do think, I just would say, I think it's a shame that it would be a shame if some of the thinking that went into the local industrial strategies that were put together over the last couple of years were lost. I think in some areas of the country, I know that we don't have an industrial strategy in the same way. We've got a new name for it and we have a plan for growth, but there was a lot of work that went into those local industrial strategies that got a lot of buy-in from local business and local politicians. It would be a shame if those were lost. I think there's a lot to be built on there. And then just finally, kind of similarly on public investment, this has been ramping up for many years. It's not a quick process where you put together things like HS2, the whole Northern Powerhouse agenda, investment in a lot of sort of fallen behind places in the UK, left behind places in science, universities, arts, transport, etc. is happening in large scale. The net zero agenda is going to be a further source of huge investment like that. But again, I don't think we can do all of this by kind of handing out goodies from Whitehall. Even though that there's a part for that, where particularly with things like net zero, where national government in the end owns the budgets and the responsibilities. But I do think we need more local ownership of these budgets, more integration of public investment priorities with local strategies, and ultimately more local control of resources and even revenues, dare I say it. And this I hesitate to get into things like tax and local taxation, and I know that Jesse won't get into it because the Chancellor would have his head. But we've done a little bit in terms of allowing councils to keep growth in business rates, and but we don't really have a proper devolved structure for local taxation, local control of resources, and so I would again, I think that's the single biggest thing we could do, is be more radical in that space. I'll stop there.
Great, thank you, Rupert. I'll now pass to Felicity. Thanks, Felicity.
Good afternoon, everyone. And I just want to warn you that there's very intense thunder and lightning over Parliament at the moment. So if you hear a crash or a bang, that's the explanation for it. It's a real pleasure to be with you this afternoon. And I think it's clear that government does need to set a framework and strategy for levelling up. And government does need to make some initial investments. But it's clear in my mind that the majority of levelling up needs to be funded by the private sector. Now, government has done an awful lot. If you look at our Towns Fund, the Shared Prosperity Fund, Gareth has already alluded to the Levelling Up Fund, which will be £4.8 billion, the Infrastructure Bank, and also government has already put in place tax incentives. So if you look at free ports, for instance, there will be incentives there for companies to invest in those free ports. And also, I would argue that the super deduction with the 130% capital allowances will encourage investment in some of the northern and Midlands areas, which are more focused on manufacturing than the south, which is more focused on the service sector. So I think government is doing an awful lot, both in terms of public investment and in terms of incentivization. But it really does need the private sector to make this work. And I would say if we look at offshore wind, that is a good combination of public sector, but really the weight being driven by the private sector. So the public sector has put in place the contracts for difference, but it really is the private sector that has provided the bulk of the funding. So it raises the question, why is the private sector currently investing more in the south? And once we get the answer to that, then we can replicate the answer and improve what we need to do. And this is not simply an issue of north versus south, because I talk from the perspective of a constituency in London, which does have a very, very deprived area. So I think it's very important to say that levelling up is levelling up across the country for communities that have been left behind. But if you do look at successful areas, there are some very, very obvious key themes. One is there is good transport infrastructure. And so that is clearly very important. And government does need to take the lead on that, at least initially. Good education and skills. If you look at London, London is full of graduates. So what we do need to do is we need to ensure that we don't have a brain drain of everyone leaving regions to come to London. We need to make it attractive for people to stay in their home counties. And I think, again, government is doing a very good job there. If you think about the National Infrastructure Bank will be based in Leeds, Treasury is obviously moving people to Darlington. I think housing is also key. And this is actually a reason for people to leave the south. If you look at how expensive housing is in London at the moment and how much more you can get outside London, then that is a driver for highly qualified people to move out of London. And actually, I was looking the other day at household income after housing costs. And it's actually interesting that London is below average there. So if you take housing costs off take-home salaries, you're actually worse off than average to be in London. But I think what is also very important is that we almost curate centres of excellence. If you think about what has happened round about Cambridge University, for instance, the science parks, the focus on biotech. And I think we've got the real opportunity to do this in the North and the Midlands. Renewable energy has already been alluded to by Rupert. Advanced manufacturing is somewhere a different topic where we can curate skills. For instance, Sheffield University has got a very, very strong research centre that we can build almost an ecosystem around that. Newcastle University, another example. And clearly we do already have centres of excellence in the North and in the Midlands for advanced engineering. I think it's also going to be very important to get investors out to the regions. You know, the Prime Minister takes investors and companies out on trade missions to other countries. We almost need to do that, a roadshow of our regions to show the capabilities that there are. So in summary, government needs to set the framework, incentivize business to go to the regions, but ultimately it is for private capital to make this work.
Thank you, Felicity. Catherine, after you.
Great, thank you very much. And let me just start by saying how pleased we are at the City of London Corporation to be sponsoring today's event, and it's on a particularly timely topic. I'm having trouble with my mute button, quite apart from the thunder outside, so if I go blank, that's why. I will come straight back. So in last week's Queen's speech, of course, we heard the renewed commitment to levelling up, to helping create greater shared prosperity across the country. And I think very few people would question the importance of that, for creating a fairer, more prosperous and more successful UK. And the big question for us today on how we turn this ambition into a reality, and on that big question, my core message, I think, is going to be around the role of the city and the financial and professional services sector that carries our name has in playing. We believe it has a central role to play in supporting growth and opportunity countrywide, including impacting those areas which have been damaged most by the financial crash or by the decline of traditional industries. And I'm going to sort of, I suppose, flip between London as place and the city as place and the city as sector. Since its founding as Londinium almost 2,000 years ago, London has obviously been an important centre for trade for the UK. From the warehouses and docks of old London to the office blocks and trading floors of today, the wealth generated here has been a real driver of the UK economy. Not the only driver, but a real, obviously not, but a significant driver. And the financial and professional services sector, which carries our name, is an important part of that. But I really want to say very strongly that that is, although it's called the city, in fact, it's a sector that's spread across the UK. 2/3 of the jobs from the sector are based outside London in places like Birmingham, Manchester and Glasgow and beyond. So it's a UK-wide sector. But London as place still has a significant role to play, because London is a global gateway to the rest of the UK. Its exceptional international reach enables what has been termed a spin-off investment to other cities and regions. I'm told that more than 1 in 10 foreign direct investment projects in the UK stemmed from initial investment into London, just demonstrating its role in promoting its key role in promoting growth and opportunities countrywide. And that role is going to be more important than ever as we look towards the economic recovery that we now all need even more so to see. So that's going to be very important. And I think we also need to look at the potential for the city and the financial and professional services sector more generally as an enabler of international trade. Its role in supporting firms across the UK and from all sectors. And that's from, this isn't simply about the finance, that's from the lawyers drafting a contract to help sell a product, to the bankers providing a letter of credit, to the insurers covering transported goods. Financial and professional services firms have a key role, vital role to play in helping UK firms navigate the international trading landscape. We recently published a report, and I'll try to get a copy, a link planted in chat for people. We published a report, The City of London, an Ecosystem Enabling International Trade, that looks at that often overlooked role, the role of the sector in enabling trade as well as actually financing it and financing jobs and growth. Looking at how we can promote growth and productivity countrywide will, as people have already suggested, require really joined up thinking from both private and public finance. And the UK Infrastructure Bank is going to be one initiative that has great potential to make a real difference here. And it'll be very good to discuss that a little bit further later on. We do need to be sure, we do need to ensure that we don't overlook the profound inequalities that exist within regions as well as between regions. And levelling up, I would suggest, needs to address the inequalities that exist between households and communities across all our regions. I'm really glad that Felicity has already mentioned a key point for me, and that is the need to remember London too, which has one of the greatest wealth inequalities in the UK. I think the Smith Institute observed that it was a large poor town cohabiting uneasily with a large rich one, and that's only been exacerbated by COVID. So I think our focus needs to be on working collaboratively to grow the overall size of the cake and in turn the size of the slice that each of us enjoys. To speak a little bit about our own work with the rest of the UK, through our work with the UK's regions and nations, we're seeking to do just that. To support levelling up, private finance must be channeled where it can have the greatest impact. And what we're trying to do is to use the global reach of the city to actively highlight opportunities for inward investment across the UK to international investors. From our discussions with city leaders, with regional leaders elsewhere, it's clear that we have many shared priorities in which the financial and professional services can play an integral part. And we really want to work with other parts of the UK in making the case for investment, whether it's in infrastructure or whether it's in growing innovative firms across a range of sectors and specialisms. Let me just highlight 4 particular initiatives we're involved in, which I think are relevant to today's discussion. First of all, we have a project, Finance for Sustainable Growth, where we're working with leaders elsewhere in the UK, looking at how we can use the city's financial expertise to promote green growth across the regions and nations, building on the strong clusters of sustainable business that already exist and supporting innovation that's critical to a greener future. We do know from our discussions with institutional investors that there's great appetite to place capital across the regions and nations of the UK. They see real potential for significant returns, particularly on green and sustainable projects, but there isn't always that connector with the capital that can be brought in and those strong pockets of opportunity that exist. And we really are seeing more and more local leaders building strong portfolios of net zero projects, which give the potential for investing. So that's one focus for us, trying to connect pockets of opportunity with the investment opportunities that the city can provide. Secondly, we're working with the Impact Investing Institute on the potential to mobilise greater flows of local government pension scheme investment into place-based impact investing. And this, I think, goes back to something that Rupert raised right at the beginning. We think this has real potential to deliver both financial returns and positive economic, social and environmental outcomes for communities, towns and regions. And we'll be publishing our research white paper on this shortly, looking at the barriers that might need to be overcome to unlock those pools of capital. Thirdly, skills, already mentioned, but skills, particularly digital skills, are going to be, well, they're already a priority for many cities, and they're going to be absolutely key to the UK's future competitiveness. I've seen an estimate that by 2030, 90% of the workforce will need to be reskilled. Where that comes from, I'm not quite sure, but clearly there is going to be a huge skills need as we look to the future. It's very good to see the government publish further details on the steps that they plan to take to help achieve this following last week's Queen's speech. We'll be pursuing this agenda again with our partners across the UK through our work, particularly with the Financial Services Skills Commission, which is very focused on the skills that the financial services sector needs. And finally, Felicity, you spoke about curating centres of excellence and clusters across the UK. Absolutely, I think that's going to be really important. And I would say one area in which we should be doing that are the tech clusters that exist, particularly around many of our universities. We supported the Khalifa review on tech. I don't like to use the word fintech because I think that's too narrow, but the Khalifa review on fintech, basically. We would strongly support the recommendations there, and particularly the recommendations around encouraging clusters. So in conclusion, I'd just say we're absolutely clear that the city, both as place and as sector, has a key role to play in levelling up. Our focus at the City Corporation is on collaboration, working with our partners across the UK, but also business partners from the financial and professional services sector, and using our voice and resources to promote countrywide growth, benefiting both, we believe, London and the whole of the UK. As I said, very pleased to be supporting today's event. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. And my mute button held out for that. I will now work out what's wrong with it. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you, Catherine. Last but not least, Minister Jessie Norman, please, after you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Gareth, and thank you everyone who's taken part in this, and thank you Onward for organising this terrific event, and very interesting. And of course, absolutely inevitably, as Rupert indicated, vast numbers of what I might have said have already been said by others, and much better than I would ever say them. So I'm thankful to them for that. Let me just say, if I may, a couple of things around the edges of what's been discussed, and then we can open the conversation up. I'm aware that we're past the halfway mark, so we should try to get to questions as quickly as we can. I mean, the first thing is this. Of course, the Onward paper today is all about foreign direct investment, and our question is who's paying for it, and the general position, which is that ultimately the private sector is going to lead, and it's going to lead on the basis of investment returns, must be right, and rightly so. I suppose I would highlight three things. I mean, one is the reason why people invest in this country, the reason why we have such a remarkable record of attracting foreign direct investment over the years, is because the UK has been a great place to do business. And so the regime is what really matters. And, you know, one could actually turn the logic of the paper back on its head and say, look, we haven't had all these wheezes and tweaks, and yet we have managed to attract vast amounts of foreign direct investment over the years. Why has that been the case? The reason is because we have high quality projects. We have a phenomenal financial sector. We have very high quality professional advisory firms. We have a very stable rule of law and judicial system that guarantees property rights. And we have broadly speaking, low tax rates and predictable tax rates. Now, of course, there is always scope for improvement in different areas, parts of that, but the regime is what really drives investment. And so the things that we're trying to do, from a government standpoint, is to improve the regime. And that takes us, I suppose, into two areas. One is tax, and the other is what we might call institutions. Now, from a tax perspective, I think it's fair to say that for obvious reasons, I'm not going to comment. That's already been mentioned. I'm not going to comment on future tax policy, or indeed particularly on current tax policy. Let me pick up a couple of points that have been discussed that I think are pretty germane. One is to reiterate and re-emphasize the point that Felicity made about the super deductions. Super deductions are a really important idea. Kickstart some of that 100 to 140 odd billion pounds worth of cash that's sitting in corporate balance sheets, get it invested, get it into plant and equipment, and get that, try to shift the dial significantly, if we possibly can, in the way in which we support investments in productivity enhancing machinery. And that is part of a wider strategy. It goes back a long way to the kinds of work that was done some years ago when George Osborne was Chancellor about wage compression and pushing people, raising wages, but also nudging productivity higher by encouraging firms to buy kit rather than to, as it were, get away with relatively inexpensive labour. So that, I suppose, is one key thing. And of course, it does have a slant to the north and to regions outside London, West Midlands and other parts of the country, because of the relatively greater capital intensity in those parts of the country, and rightly so. So it is indeed itself a levelling up measure of quite an important significance. The other thing I would say, obviously, is free ports. I mean, free ports is a policy that we've accelerated very fast out of the Chancellor. He wrote a paper about it. As you know, it's very close to his heart. And it's already clear that the mere signalling effect of free ports in terms of the attention and the energy that's driven has had a very, very galvanizing, as it were, impact on public debate in the areas where free ports there. There was a very lively competition for it. And of course, we think it will have a galvanic effect on investment as well. That's the part of it. So tax is important, but institutions are also really important. And as you will be aware, there are lots of institutions that the government either has or is putting in place designed to support this agenda. You've got, the DIT as a separate entity, very much now building on the work it's been doing over the past few years to put trade deals in place by by really re-emphasizing the emphasis and the energy in relation to foreign direct investment and support for our own businesses, of course, overseas as well. You've got the National Infrastructure Strategy, which we published before Christmas, which Rupert's mentioned, 600 odd billion pounds worth of investment contemplated under that, roughly half public, roughly half private. That's 300 billion pounds worth of investment. And of course, that itself is complemented. We haven't mentioned it, but it's important to mention the regulatory regime under which a lot of private investment takes place, which is probably, certainly one of the best developed, if not the best developed in the world as regards regulated asset-based models, and of course, contracts for difference, which I was very much involved in when I was at Bayes many years ago. We were pushing the offshore wind agenda. So all of that creates a really supportive investment for private capital, but we have wanted to go further. And that's why I think the UK Infrastructure Bank is such an important move. And I think I pat my officials very warmly on the back, because getting something like this up and running in 6 months, an institution of this scale, learning from all the other experience that's been had in national development banks of different kinds, and sorting out some of the really important fundamental questions about whether it should be crowding in private capital, and if so, how, and how not to be competing with it. Those are really, I think, a very significant achievement. And you will have seen we've announced a chair, Chris Grigg, world-class chair, and we're in the market for, I don't think it's any secret, we're in the market for a long-term, full-time chief executive. We've got an interim in place, which is great. And so we are looking to make that a global standard of infrastructure development bank of its kind. And I think it will be. The evidence has been tremendous in terms of the energy and the interest that it's excited. So you've got those three sides of things. You've got the overall regime, you've got the tax side, and then you've got institutions. And if we can get some of that right, then I think there is absolutely the possibility to turbocharge some of the investment that we all want to see, and also to make sure that it is intelligently deployed around the country in a way that supports the twin goals of levelling up and net zero, which lie at the heart of the government's overall economic strategy.
Great, Minister. Thank you so much. Thanks to everybody for your contributions so far. We've had a few questions in already, which I'll turn to, but just now is the time to put in that Q&A section if you've got a question for the panel. Let me get the ball rolling and give the audience some time to get a few more questions in there. Rupert, let me start with you. You mentioned about projects. I know this is localism. I know this is something close to your heart. Isn't the issue, though, and I would agree with you on the pipeline of projects, isn't the issue in terms of the viability, investment viability of projects at a local level? And the issue is not necessarily where the decisions are made, but who is making them, and that the fact that they need to be independent of politicians who are on an electoral cycle. These are long-term decisions that need to be made, aren't they? Yeah, they are. And look, if you want to get private investment to lead to the reinvigoration of an economy or a local economy that has fallen behind the national average, you need to have a long-term coherent strategy about what are the comparative advantages of the area that can realistically be successful, that can attract private investment as well as public sector support. So clearly free ports in those areas where they exist are going to kind of suck activity into them, and that is a tool that government can use to sort of help determine the location of activity. But I would argue that over the long term, more important is to have sort of consistent strategies in terms of bringing together skills provision, transport, universities, and the sort of private investment opportunities. And so often in the past that has entailed having kind of key anchor investors, either whether you're trying to start an entirely new specialism or anchor investors to kind of cement and prevent the loss of an existing specialism for the area, and then kind of build from there. And I think that the evidence on this is pretty clear now from around the world that what works is long-term consistent policy, and you can't do this overnight. And what's crucial is that you don't try to rip it all up and start again. And I think the UK
UK across huge numbers of areas of policy has in the past had that weakness, and that's the problem of what has been a very centralized system. I think we've now got some very good policies in place in areas that have suffered from that. So I'd say further education and skills is an area of that where we've now actually got a very good policy framework. Things like T-levels, I think, will be transformational if they get the long-term funding and sort of time to evolve and aren't ripped up by whoever the next, government or minister is. But the other bit of evidence, I think, is that you do get that longevity more where plans are controlled locally, because you've got buy-in from local communities, ownership of local businesses, and that even if you get, I'm a big fan of metro mayors, so I think that we will find these are still kind of young institutions, but I think you'll find that actually, the sort of vision that Andy Street is putting together for the West Midlands is something that is not party political. And if, God forbid, Andy Street were ever to not be mayor of the West Midlands, and even if, God forbid, there was a Labour mayor of the West Midlands, I think you would find that actually there was a huge amount of continuity under the surface in these sort of local development priorities. And I think that businesses see that and are reassured by that. And I think the same is not true when it comes to national government. And so if these sort of local priorities are controlled by national government, you're much more likely to get this sort of chopping and changing. Whereas sort of localism, I think, because you get that greater buy-in and so it's less politicized, you're much more likely to get that sort of long-term strategic approach. And I think central government has a crucial part to play in that, but I think the ownership locally is very important.
Great, thank you. Let's turn to the questions that started to roll in. Why don't I turn to Felicity? One of the questions that has been asked is, what is more important in levelling up, infrastructure or skills?
Well, I believe that they're both vitally important, but I think our human capital is most important. And that has been the success of London and the South East, that we have been able to attract people from all over the country. So ultimately, it is human capital. I also would say that in levelling up, we also need to be very focused on the natural advantages of different areas, because what we're not trying to do is to level down one area in order to level up another area. It's not a question of taking it from there to put it there. So we need to look at the competitive advantages of each of our regions, and Freeport's as a case in point, offshore wind another, where there are universities with specific skill sets, because this truly does need to be a levelling up agenda if we're going to keep the whole country behind it and on track.
Great, thank you very much. Let me come to a question specifically for Jessie. And Jessie, you mentioned it in your remarks about being able to marry the green agenda and levelling up. And actually this question hits it on the head in a way. Can the announced government green gilt direct investment to the regions to help both level up and tackle climate change? And what kind of investments would that include?
Well, I think I'm right in saying that the Treasury hasn't announced full details of the green gilt, and so I'm not going to anticipate what my colleagues may say. It's not actually a policy area of mine, but I think it is clear in principle that there may well be a very important regional impact on just through the, as it were, the project selection that constitutes the projects that are funded by green gilts. And of course, we don't have to look very far to see some of the tremendous potential that exists in the Northeast, for example, for green energy and green projects. It's already there and it can be built further. And the same will be true in parts of the country where, for example, if we do move into hydrogen and of course, carbon capture and storage. So there's not going to be any shortage of, I think, potentially interesting projects of a different kind. What is specifically qualifies, that's a matter for further discussion, and it'll all become clear in due course. But I think what's important is the initiative to say we want to build a green gilt portfolio. We want to build a a yield curve of green gilts. We want to be reaching out to international and domestic investment in that area. And I think that's extremely important.
Thank you. When we come to Catherine, one of the questions from Eleanor is, there has been a huge amount of churn in skills policy over the last 30 years. How can that piece of the levelling up puzzle given long-term stability? You mentioned about skills in your opening remarks. Do you have any views on that question?
Well, I think there's a big political question here, which I leave to others to answer. But I think Rupert is right about the need for long-term stability in our approach. And I think when it comes to the skills needed for the financial and the financial services sector, there is a question around ensuring that the ensuring actually that the firm that there are industry standards that are set, and that people are working with each other in the skills that are needed for the workforce, so that you don't just train an accountant to be an accountant at Deloitte or one of the other big four, for example. You share some of those skills and so on. You have a framework that you can share, so that the workforce generally benefits, and that we look at how we open doors and improve access. So I think that's a question of partnership between not only members of the sector itself, but also with the higher education providers. But I'd just go back to my core point that there's a need for, there is a significant need for upskilling that we've got at the moment, particularly with the pace of change. There's going to be a need for partnership in how we approach that.
Okay, thank you. Maybe we'll come back to skills. There's a couple more coming in now, but we've already had a couple on an area of growing discussion, let me put it like that, in political circles around social investment. So let me ask Rupert, direct some of these towards you, if that's okay, Rupert. What opportunity is there in this levelling up agenda to really bolster social investment? There's some concern that we've not really optimised the ability to mobilise capital into the sector. We've had big society capital, we've got the social investment tax relief. Some could argue they've been suboptimal in terms of mobilising capital. Some of the questions are asking, is this an opportunity for social investment? How much is about data and public provision, that kind of thing? Any views?
I do have views, actually, and I think many of the same issues apply as with private sector for-profit investment, which is there is a lot of capital that is interested in social investment, and there are a lot of investors who would like to put money to work at scale in social investment, but it's about there is a lack of easily accessible projects and potential investment candidates. We just don't have the pipeline coming through of kind of scalable social investment projects across the country. It's partly kind of hard to find, but it's also, I think, just lack of pipeline. It's a great excuse for me to plug a charity that I co-founded and I'm chair of, called The Four, and we specifically try and fund very small scale charities and social enterprises across the country, that with the aim of those becoming the next sort of pipeline for larger scale social investment. And we've had a few success stories, but I think here it's a very specific issue. I think it can play a big part in levelling up, but I think the problem is it's a long, slow process of building capacity and a pipeline of potential projects.
Okay, maybe we'll come back to that. I just want to get as many questions. We've got quite a few rolling in. A slightly tricky one for the Minister, for Jessie. I'm going to ask it anyway, just because I like you. The question is, there's a risk of mixed messages from the government. On the one side, you're pushing low tax regimes with free ports, and on the other, you're announcing higher headline corporation tax. Which path is the government planning to pursue?
Well, I must say, I hope you don't mind my saying, Gareth, that I don't think that's an enormously difficult question. I mean, we will still have the lowest corporation headline tax rate in the G7, even once the raises have gone through. And so we have no ambition not to be. We want to remain competitive in corporation tax terms. But the unfortunate fact of the matter is that we've just gone through a year in which GDP fell by just under 25%, and we had the worst economic crisis for 300 years in peacetime. So we mustn't lose that fact. I mean, it's terribly easy, I think, to kind of, because the government's policies in many ways, fingers crossed, let us pray that they remain so, have been quite effective. But it's quite easy to forget the scale of the economic disaster we've been through in the last few years. And it's entirely appropriate for the Chancellor to try to rebuild and start the process of rebuilding the national finances, as he has done. And as you will have detected, there's quite a clever interaction between the super deduction, which is designed to get corporation spending moving and investment moving, and then the tax change after that. So I think there's another question that's worth just asking about, which is, in a way, just to come back to. I don't want to miss some of the other questions that have been asked. I think there's some really interesting topics that have been raised, and you're right to go to each of us for a question. But I think it's worth just, if I may, glossing a couple of the remarks that were made by others, because they've been really interesting. And I suppose the point I want to come back to is a way the point Rupert made about longevity of investment. And there, I just want to flag, I don't think it was really noticed, but it's a very important part of levelling up, I think, which is the Stronger Towns Fund, which has not really been kind of picked up. 101 towns up and down the country, essentially the Heseltine approach: get together, figure out what you want to do, private and voluntary-led board, sector-led board, qualifying with putting a plan together for private investment, of which up to 25 million gets funded by the government. That's been a phenomenal success in terms of convening in a bipartisan way, hopefully resistant to political change, what is potentially a long-term investment plan, and forcing, nudging, encouraging, lovingly enticing each of these areas to think about what an integrated plan would look like. And what is so fascinating is that, of course, these plans are very different from each other. The good ones, you can't read the plan without knowing, because they tell you what the place is. There's nothing, as it were, lift and shift about them in the really good ones. And that ties in all the stuff we think of, hard infrastructure, but it also goes to the point Visti made about skills, because you're absolutely talking about the relationship between those two, and also heritage, arts, culture, all the stuff. There's a really good article last week on Conservative Home by Rachel Wolfe, just picking up some of that. And I just think it's really important to think of that wider context when we're thinking about levelling up, and we're thinking about the role that government can play in supporting local change in a resilient and long-term way.
Great. Well, thank you. And I should say to the panelists, we're getting through the questions now. So if you want to come in on any of the points that others are making, please do just let me know and unmute. We've had a couple more coming in. One of the aspects that talked about a lot in Parliament is SMEs and the need to support SMEs. Obviously, the government through COVID has provided tremendous amount of support for small businesses. But before COVID, there was a clear SME funding gap. One of the questions asked is how do we close the SME funding gaps that exist, specifically in the north of England? Is equity or debt more important to those organisations? So while you're not a Northern MP, I know, Felicity, would you like to take that question? Because I know you've spoken a bit about SME financing in the past.
Yes, I do think that SME financing is critically important. And I was also delighted to see in the budget the changes to corporation tax were tapered, with a lot of SMEs not going up in terms of the corporation tax rate and others being tapered. But financing gaps do exist. In terms of what is the appropriate capital structure, I would argue it's a combination of equity and debt. I am slightly concerned, talking to businesses in my own constituency, that SMEs have taken on a lot of debt financing during COVID, in particular through a lot of the government schemes. Now, we're all hoping that we have a very quick and aggressive rebound. If we don't have that, I think the reality is that we will have to look at refinancing quite a bit of that debt, and that will have to come out through a refinancing in equity. But the base structure should be a combination. Now, I know historically a lot of SMEs have simply gone to their local high street lender and have not explored alternative options. And I think it is very important that we work with high street banks, with venture capital funds, to really offer the whole array of financial products to SMEs.
Great, thank you. And I think, Catherine, I think you wanted to come in.
Yes, thanks very much. I signalled before I listened to the whole of what Felicity had to say, and I have to say I completely agree with you, Felicity. First of all, on that debt burden that many of our SMEs are going to be carrying after the pandemic and the challenge that that will pose into the long run. I do think that's something we need to be focusing on. But and secondly, the need to connect firms with the full range of financing that's available. And that's something we hear. I mentioned the pilot that we have trying to connect people with capital. That's something we hear. Sometimes they don't know the way, people don't know the way through to the capital that is available. So signposting the pathways, I think, is going to be very important. But then what I would say about SMEs which are at the stage of being startups, how important it is that we look at their access to funds before they decide to scale up and move somewhere else. And that's something which we've been looking at, particularly in the tech sector, making sure that there are opportunities for people to access funds to grow and retain their businesses here. And I think that's an issue across the UK. Obviously, we're talking about a whole different set of companies, but I think making sure that people have access to the funds, but then access to the funds when they want to grow is going to be critical.
Great, thank you. I think, Rupert, you had your, there you go.
Thanks. I mean, I do think I've come on quite a long journey, having sort of, when I entered government in the sort of, started working in the Treasury in the coalition government, and there was a big focus then on access to finance for SMEs, and we thought it was a kind of crisis issue. I've become convinced over time that there's a more structural problem with SME lending in the UK, and that there is a case for kind of pretty large-scale government intervention, and actually that the kind of emergency interventions as through the COVID crisis could potentially provide a model to do that. I mean, I think that there is benefit to be had from new entrants in SME lending. There's peer-to-peer is kind of growing as an alternative source of finance, but fundamentally for the major banks in the UK, SME lending is a low-margin business that they're never really going to be that interested in. And I think that when we look at other countries have come to solutions to this, including, again, I point to the USA, where we think of, again, as this sort of free market economy, but actually the Small Business Administration in the US employs many thousands of people and guarantees a stunningly high proportion of SME loans in the US through a network of sort of state and regional banks that it has relationships with. And that was one of the reasons they could get their Paycheck Protection Program loans out so quickly, is that those relationships existed. And I think that using the kind of bounce back loans and the other, using the sort of mechanisms under the auspices perhaps of the British Business Bank, we could do something a lot more radical and also freed from some of the constraints of EU state aid rules. This is an area where actually you could actually do something that we couldn't do a couple of years ago, and to have a much more aggressive and ambitious approach to SME lending. And I think that would be particularly beneficial in levelling up, because that sort of finance drought is particularly problematic outside of London and the South East.
Totally right, and I would just throw in KfW, who also have a very similar program of SME.
Exactly, and they could only do that in Germany because KfW pre-existed the European state aid rules, so there was a grandfathering process. So we were within the European Union unable to create KfW, even though it already existed in Germany. Now we're outside the European Union, we can actually do what the state aid rules were trying to prevent us from doing, which is subsidise the cost of SME lending, which I think is basically a necessary thing to do.
Exactly right. Let me come to Jesse on that specific point, because I know you and your officials looked extensively across the world at development banks. KfW is obviously a bit of a gold standard for many. Do you see the National Infrastructure Bank as the first step towards a KfW, or what's your thinking on this?
That's a very leading question. I'm going to stay away from that question. Thank you, Gareth, for that. But listen, the KfW is a completely sui generis post-war recovery institution, which is, as Rupert says, has massively benefited from the grandfathered arrangements that it's inherited. And our approach, as George Bernard Shaw said, we're fussy, we're always content with the best of everything. We're trying to take the best bits of what we can. I do think that there's a very important point. I mean, if you're going to get SME lending really moving, then, obviously one's trying to mobilize all of the tacit knowledge that exists locally and within supply chains about those organizations. And I think there's a potentially very, very interesting agenda. And you may be aware that, Paul Collier and others have done some quite interesting work on thinking about how those mechanisms might work and how capital can be released and energized locally to support those enterprises. So I'm very supportive of the overall agenda. I think it's important to keep that there. It's not my part of the Treasury, and I'm not going to go any further than that. But I do think that there's a widespread recognition that that sector of the economy is going to have to be given whatever support we can to help it to grow and to thrive, but without hopefully distorting the market system too far, rather as it were, correcting and improving it.
Can I make a suggestion, Jesse? One of the problems here has been that the government's always been very reluctant to step in because precisely it's the sort of lack of local knowledge and decision making. But the peer-to-peer lenders have developed some incredible technology now that actually basically solves those problems. And the government could, white label or get behind some of these peer-to-peer lenders and use some of that technology. And using the public sector balance sheet to reduce the cost of that finance would be pretty revolutionary.
Now, I think, Rupert, if you were in the Treasury, I think the first comment you would make is, well, that's all very interesting, Jesse, but if that's the case, why isn't we can allow those organisations to demonstrate their competitive advantage by succeeding before we take a view?
No, fundamentally, it's high cost, low margin business. That's why the big banks won't do it, and that's why there's a case for subsidy.
That is certainly true, and if you look at the bank balance sheets, you'll see that actually there's an amazingly small amount of their lending actually goes to business, and indeed to businesses that need it. And so there's a much deeper problem there, not just one affecting small business.
All right. Well, Rupert mentioned the United States, so let me turn to a slightly different question. I'm going to ask Felicity this question first, but I might ask a few of our panelists. It comes from an audience member, Tom Peters, who's said it's been a great discussion, and I would agree. He's interested on the panel's view of the Biden administration's global minimum corporation tax rate proposal as a way of raising revenue to help pay for leveling up, particularly around smaller and medium-sized businesses. Felicity, how do you feel about President Biden's proposals around a minimum corporate tax rate?
Yes, my gut instinct is to say that I want to retain autonomy here, but there's no question that there is international arbitrage of tax rates. And so what I would like to see us do is to work in partnership with other countries to eliminate that arbitrage rather than writing in stone a minimum corporation tax level, which may be very inflexible going forward and may not allow us to be able to manage and to adapt to the particular issues that our economy faces, because it's quite clear that the global economy do not always just work in step together. And sometimes tax absolutely needs to be used as a tool to get your economy going. So my sense is that we need more international cooperation on tax, but I would not want to go as far as a minimum corporation tax.
And Rupert, what do you think?
I hope we will embrace it. I think that there's a huge opportunity now. There's been these OECD BEPS, so base erosion and profit shifting, which is a very, very technical name for basically an international attempt to try and undermine the practice of international corporations shifting profits to low tax jurisdictions, which is a problem for countries like the UK because we've been losing taxable profits like that for many, many, many years. And there is now the potential for a grand bargain internationally that the Biden administration has unlocked, and it basically means that the US will allow the rest of the world to find find a way to tax essentially digital business, but businesses where it's the big tech companies, but it's also much broader than that, to find a basis for taxing those companies on the basis of the location of their customers, which is what countries like the UK have been trying to do with these digital taxes. That basically, rather than having a kind of lots of these digital taxes springing up in individual countries like the UK and France and elsewhere, find a global way of doing that, and in return agreeing some kind of minimum corporate tax. I mean, the realistic level that might be agreed at, is going to be somewhere in the range of 12.5 to 18. The 12.5 is Ireland. I mean, the Biden administration is proposing 21. Most people think you could agree something around 18. That would be pretty game changing. I would basically put a lot of these low tax jurisdictions out of business. It would mean a lot more revenue for countries like the UK. And actually, given that the UK is currently in the process of raising its corporate tax level, it would give us a lot of cover for that in terms of minimizing the hit to competitiveness from that, particularly at the same time as the UK is kind of raising its own tax rate.
But it was tried before, right? When you were in the Treasury, was it suggested? I understand it was floated when you were around. Is that right?
So yeah, so this OECD project has been going on for some time. So David Gauke, who was the Exchequer Secretary, was sort of pursuing this for some time. We were pretty keen on the OECD agenda. There were some things that have already come out of it that have allowed countries like the UK to raise a lot more revenue than we used to through anti-avoidance measures. But the core deal was basically kind of run into the sand, and the Trump administration was not really willing to engage. And these digital service taxes were seen as kind of very aggressive by the US, because it was basically European countries trying to tax US tech companies. But the Biden administration proposal is a sort of potentially a brilliant coming together of incentives, and there is a kind of grand bargain potentially to be done. I think there is going to be a plan presented by the OECD to the G20 finance ministers for their meeting in July, and the UK should absolutely not sign up to a minimum global tax unilaterally. It has to be part of a global agreement, and in return for our ability to properly tax some of these global technology companies and others that we currently can't tax properly, I think there's a great deal potentially to be done, which I'm not sure it's sort of directly relevant to levelling up. I think it certainly helps sort of the UK be competitive and raise money for the kind of investments that Jesse's been talking about, but it would certainly be a good thing internationally, I think.
Thank you. Yes, no, it was very intelligently linked, the way it was asked, to the levelling up agenda as a revenue raising opportunity. But let me move on. One of the questions that's come in just a few minutes ago is, there are clear differences in productivity and income across the country. Both gauge prosperity, but do so in different ways. What is the priority for the government? So I guess the question is, are we looking at levelling up incomes, or are we starting first and foremost with tackling the pervasive issue of productivity? Jesse, can I ask you that question?
Yes, sure. And let me just come in behind what Rupert's just said about BEPS. I think one of the things people forget is how much of a leader the UK has been in recent years on combating erosion of tax revenue bases and diverted profits tax, all the stuff we do on hybrids and other forms of avoidance. We're very kind of proactive about that, and massive credit to the Chancellor. He's been very proactive on that as well as at the G7 and of course with the G20 coming up and in the OECD. So we hope that the two pillars of digital taxation and the other pillar of potentially a minimum corporate tax will come together in a grand deal, as Rupert suggested, and we wait to see, and we'll be pushing as hard as we can to pull that kind of deal off. And I think the UK has potentially got quite an important role in its presidency, and also as a kind of convener and leader in tax theorizing and tax regulation. On the issue of productivity, listen, I think it's famously true that levelling up is one of those things that is a quite a diffuse concept, and it means different things to different people. But I think it also means different things in different places. The UK has got a serious productivity issue overall. We know that, and many of the things we've talked about today are designed to try to change that. I can't pass this without mentioning the work we're doing to digitize the tax system. That's going to have a potential effect of nudging some of these less digitally enabled companies into digital taxes and therefore into higher productivity elsewhere. we hope, in their businesses. So that's a big issue. But actually, I think in many ways that the core of levelling up is about recognizing the context dependency of a particular reason why an area feels ignored, feels left behind. And that's as much a cultural as an economic thing. And often it's the culture that unlocks the economics, as we've been discussing. And so I'm not sure there is a specific general answer to the question as to which of those is going to come first. Prosperity is going to be a matter of income. It's going to be a matter of productivity. It's always going to be a matter of how people feel about themselves, about their area, about where they come from, and about its prospects. And so if we can shift the dial on that, then we'll really be making some headway. And I would flag one other thing, which is, don't forget, there are lots of parts of the country where, you know, growth has been very slow, rural parts of the country, and you know, there's a lot of underemployment, and you know, it's quite important to understand that these different economic and social effects play themselves out in different parts of the country, and that we have to take a wide angle lens to understand them and to try to make them to try to create, or help them to create, a context in which they can thrive and succeed.
Excellent, thank you. Let me come to Catherine on a discussion about specifically around firms in the City of London. Obviously, I think there's about 1 million people employed in the financial services sector. A lot of those jobs are in the City of London, in London. The Treasury has kind of started leading the way in moving organisations like the National Infrastructure Bank and parts of the Treasury to the north of England. Do you think, particularly post-COVID, a lot of financial institutions will start to move staff, so moving existing jobs, good jobs, to different parts of the country, particularly in the North and Midlands?
I don't think we'll see a shift post-COVID particularly, but I just go back to my point at the beginning that 2/3 of financial services jobs are outside London already. We don't see it as a bad thing that the people are setting up centres elsewhere as well, and that is continuing. What's important to us is that the city continues to thrive because of the jobs that are there. We don't need to have the whole of the sector based in London. It isn't at the moment, and it doesn't need to be. Can I just take one particular question that's popped up actually, which is around the impact of COVID and how that's going to distort things? I do think there is a challenge here because there are areas which have suffered very significantly during the pandemic, which are going to need focus to get back up and running. The central area of London is one particular one where we've lost the office footfall, we've lost the retail footfall, and we've lost the cultural and tourism footfall. And that is going to complicate what we need to do over the next period. And we're going to need to make sure that those areas grow back, as well as looking at the levelling up agenda more generally. So I think that is a complicating factor, but I don't think banking jobs moving to other parts of the country is a worry for us at all. We see that as an opportunity so long as the UK continues to attract the jobs in the first place. They don't need to be in our square mile.
Great. Well, thank you very much. We're nearly at time, so I'm going to stop with the questions now and just leave it for a couple of minutes for each of our panelists just to give a few final thoughts based on the discussion today, which has been wide-ranging. We've covered everything from tax to skills to infrastructure, localism, metro mayors, all sorts we've covered today. So I really appreciate all the questions that have come in from our audience and, of course, to our panelists. But let me go in the order I started and leave the Minister with the final word. Rupert, do you want to give us a few moments of final thoughts based on the discussion today?
Well, I think it's been a great and wide-ranging discussion, so I don't have a huge amount to add. Maybe I'll just end with one final plug for my original point. So I totally agree with Jesse that the Stronger Towns Fund is a great example of kind of working with local communities. But I think it does slightly beg the question of why we need to create something like that from the centre of government. Like if we had properly devolved local government in England in particular, if we had metro mayors with real budgets and the ability to raise revenues, we wouldn't need Whitehall to be doling out the money. We could have genuine local funds raised through local money to deliver that, and we wouldn't have to be, in a sense, kind of leading the way from Whitehall.
Felicity.
Thank you for chairing, Gareth. I would just want to emphasise 2 points. First of all, I think levelling up needs to happen across the country. And secondly, what I would say is government should be setting the framework, but it should be driven by the private sector.
Great. And Catherine.
And I think what I would say, absolutely, this is a really important agenda. London has a big role to play in helping with levelling up, but we need a real focus on our international competitiveness in order to draw in investment for the whole UK, and that means concern for London too.
Great. And final word, thank you, Minister Jesse Norman.
Oh, well, thank you very much indeed, and thanks Onward, and thanks panelists for a great conversation. Let me just pick up the point Rupert raised, a really important point. I think there's a whole series of things just very quickly going on there. I mean, one of the things government's always trying to do is to avoid a ratchet whereby a given, as it were, funding arrangement then becomes the basis for another funding arrangement. And there is less evidence than I would like that devolution of funding has led to, as it were, a reduction in the ratchet. And I'm very happy to look at the evidence and think about that. But there are lots of areas which we're funding, Metro Mayors and others, Transforming Cities Fund, huge interventions, really important. That hasn't stopped those Metro Mayors from making lots of additional demands. And in places, devolved administrations where we have devolved tax powers, those tax powers have not been anything like as heavily used as one might have expected when that originally took place. So I think that's a wider point. Also, local authorities can, of course, borrow and do through the Public Works Loan Board, but that itself flags a wider point, which I think in a way ties some of the things we're talking about together, which is that we don't just need skills in areas, we also need skills in institutions in areas, private and public, and we need capacity. And that's a really important long-term issue. We're thinking a lot about it in government. One of the things that the Infrastructure Bank is trying to do is to create quite a deep pool of cross-government understanding of sectors, to think about development projects for sectors as well as existing projects. And so that's very much a live discussion, and one that I hope we can return to in future conversations.
Great. Well, thank you, Jesse, and thanks for all the work that you are doing and your leadership in this area. It really is appreciated, and it gives us a lot of confidence in the future. So thank you, everybody, for dialing in. Thanks to Onward for organising this, and of course to all of our panelists.